Here we are, the final week of our Advent journey. How far we've gone. We started week one with a discussion of peace, an altogether peace, and then we moved to hope. And then last week, of course, we talked about an altogether love. And we have saved this word for last, the concept of an altogether joy. And so, Matt, we're grateful that you are leading us in this one.
Candle of joy in the last week because it really is the culmination of our Advent waiting, because joy is the steadfast assurance that God is with us, and the birth of Jesus is the fulfillment of the joy of creation, that God is with us. In the Gospel of Mark, joy is mentioned only once, as opposed to the Gospel of Luke that's saturated with joy. And it begins with Zechariah, this great joy that he's offered that he and Elizabeth are going to have a child, but he doesn't quite believe it, so he is struck dumb and has to remain silent until he names the child. And there's such a beautiful moment there of sometimes in order to experience an altogether joy, it takes our silence and our stopping. And almost joy, we're really good at it. Music, decorations, inviting family together. But when family leaves and the music playlist switches from Christmas to New Year's and the presents are opened, we feel something missing. And that's because it was almost where it needed to be. And altogether joy remains. It's steadfast. I'm an elder. I'm a clergy person. So at this stage of the game, we're making sure the music is just so, we have enough candles, we've printed enough bulletins. That's almost joy. And we transition into this altogether joy, which is recognizing that whether or not we have enough bulletins, Jesus is still going to be born. So especially during this hectic moment of Advent, maybe we can take a lesson from Zechariah in being silent in order to receive joy.
So because this is the fourth week of Advent, that means we are relatively close to December 21st, which is the longest night of the year, when many churches will observe something of a longest night service or a Blue Christmas service where they will invite people who are far removed from peace and hope and love, and particularly joy in their lives. So if we can imagine for just a moment, what does an altogether joy look like for someone who's really not experiencing joy right now?
One of my friends has someone in their church, and he noticed that during the singing of the hymns during Christmas, she would literally sit, arms crossed, sour face, didn't pay much mind. So we asked her, what's going on with you? I don't want to talk about it. Weeks went by. The next year went by. Advent rolled around again, and she sat, arms crossed, upset during the hymns. And finally, she was brave enough to admit that her father had died on Christmas Day. So this season, to talk about joyful all ye nations rise, did not resonate with her. So they hosted a longest night service where she was able to vocalize her pain in a safe place. If the Psalms teach us anything, it means that we can shake our fist at God and ask, where are you? Tears have been my food day and night, as the Psalms say. The next Advent rolled around, and instead of crossing her arms and sitting back, she wept during the hymns. And in this case, crying is a healthy sign of an inbreaking of joy.
In many of our cultures today, we think that joy means happiness. And so we try to make ourselves happy by buying things or by engaging in certain actions or by owning or being in control. But the thing is that when we encounter things that make us happy, we recognize that sometimes things that make us happy, they're fleeting, they're not eternal. And you always have to search for the next thing, which is like happiness is like an almost joy, but moving into that altogether joy is a restfulness and a fullness of being together and being your full self and being together in community with the community of faith and especially with God.
Yeah.
Well, one of the biggest quotes right now, right, is what sparks joy. Does this spark joy for you? If it doesn't, right, purge it, get it out of your life, right? And it's hard sometimes, I think, in my particular setting to find joy sometimes, because a lot of times, especially during Christmas or Advent or whatever it is, joy has come in different ways for me. Seeing new things emerge throughout a process. I have found that with people under bridges, people who you would never think could ever have joy. How could they have joy? Look at them, right? And yet together through our relationships, when I see Robert walking down the street and I haven't seen him in 2 weeks, joy! Because I know that he's in a good place, because there he is. There's a commitment within joy. There's a pausing of saying, what does joy look like for me, and what does joy look like for you? And what is a lasting joy, and what are the commitments that I make to make sure that that joy lasts and sustains, and not only me, but also my brothers and sisters, or not only my brothers and sisters, but also me. And I think, and we can travel along this path that sometimes is so difficult, and where sometimes you do feel isolated, or when sometimes you do feel stuck, or when sometimes you do feel forlorn, and say, I find joy in the relationships that have taken me and gone with me through these dips, through this stuck place, through this sad place, or whatever it is. And just knowing that we're traveling this together brings a joy that I think creates life.
Well, Ingrid just named for us pretty clearly what we understand to be the antithesis of joy. Remember, week 1, we talked about the antithesis of peace being conflict, and then week 2, the opposite of hope being fear, and then last week, the opposite of love being the feeling of being fragmented. This week, what we're saying is that the opposite of joy is feeling stuck. Basically just feeling stuck in the here and now, with no capacity to see what might happen tomorrow, let alone what might happen in eternity. People sometimes feel stuck in pursuing happiness, which is fleeting and temporary, only to have that withdrawal after that fix falls away. So perhaps joy is that capacity to lift us out of our stuckness and invite the eternal into the temporary, to invite our awareness of God in the ordinary and the mundane. The hymn that many of us will be singing in a few days will be the great hymn of joy, Joy to the World. And the end of that first verse is a beautiful convergence of the eternal and the temporary. Heaven and nature sing. Heaven and nature sing, which means that even as I'm going through the mundane of walking and experiencing nature, I can experience heaven in the here and now. Be open to the possibility that even in the mundane and the dreary of your life, God may be making you aware of joy in your life where you would otherwise not receive it. I think that is the beginning steps for an altogether joy that would be a great culmination for this Advent journey. So here we are at what may be considered to be the end of our Advent journey, but in reality, Christmas is not the end of a journey. It's just a mile marker. It's just the invitation to a whole new chapter, a whole new leg of the race. And so, while we have all 4 of our Advent candles lit, it's appropriate for us to light the center candle and to think together about what might come next as a result of this Advent journey. This center candle symbolizes the arrival of Jesus Christ in our midst. It's the Christ candle. It's the reality of what John talked about, the light that has come into the world that even the darkness could not overcome. And for John Wesley, it is appropriate for us to think about covenant renewal as a way for us to seal our Advent journey and not end it, but to continue it through an ongoing recommitment of our lives to Jesus Christ. It's really a hallmark of the Methodist movement. John Wesley discovered it in 1755 in a little church in England called Spitalfield, England. He had an invitation to the crowd of people there in August of 1755, simply to invite them to recommit their lives to Jesus. He called them specifically to confide in God and to confess their sins, to compose their spirits, to claim the covenant that God had made with them, to choose faithfulness every single day, and to connect with God in prayer. And then he just extended an invitation. And lo and behold, 1,800 people in that little church said yes to Jesus. He would write in his journal later that day, "I have never seen such a sight. May it be that the fruit of this moment may linger forever." And it has. For the people called Methodist, that moment has lingered on in what we now think of as Wesley Covenant Renewal. A lot of churches like to observe Wesley Covenant Renewal at the start of every year, which means it's an appropriate way to end the Advent journey with an opportunity to formalize one's renewed commitment to Jesus Christ. We belong to God, and we have to open ourselves up to wherever God would lead us and be willing to follow Jesus every step of the way. So that's been our hope together, that people have moved from an almost expression of the Christian faith to an all-together experience of God's love revealed in Jesus and made real through peace and hope and love and joy, not only for themselves, but for the people that they know.
Chris Wyman, in his book of poetry on joy, describes joy as durable, inexhaustible, essential, and completely inadequate. And it's because joy, true joy, sticks around. It remains with us, but it's also difficult to describe. I like to talk about joy as the steadfast assurance that God is with us, that God's presence is always with us. Sometimes that's a happy feeling, but not always. Sometimes God finds us in the midst of despair. It's like something blooming in the midst of the ashes. Now, we're really good at manufacturing an almost joy. Through music, through decorations, through presents under the tree, inviting family over. And these are all good things, but when family have gone and the tree has been brought to the curb and the presents opened, there's something missing because it's not quite the joy of our faith. Joy remains. Joy is the steadfast assurance that God is with us. And here near Christmas, we will soon experience a God with eyes and hands and feet. God is literally with us and walking with us. So may you know the joy of God's presence.